The Jasper wildfire and all of the damage sustained by the town and national park has become a bit of a jurisdictional battle. Some say it's all about bad forest management, while other people are blaming climate change. Now, to chat about this in more detail is Sun political columnist Brian Lilley, who joins us once again from Toronto. Brian, who's really at fault here for the Jasper wildfires? Perhaps it's even the pine beetles.
uh, Pine beetles, an act of God, the temperature, the state of the forest. There's a lot going on here. I find it really disturbing that immediately after this horrific fire, you had people coming out and saying, "Well, it's because Danielle Smith doesn't believe in climate change. That's why this happened." Uh, can we at least take a beat after the fire? After all the devastation? No, apparently not. And so you've got people are saying, see, this is proof, this is climate change, this is why we have to act. Well, acting would include good forest management practices, which apparently Parks Canada was not about. And guess what? The area around Jasper, I've got people saying to me, Hal, no, the town of Jasper is a municipality, and therefore the province has responsibility. Well, the area around Jasper is called a national park, and Parks Canada is responsible for the forestry management. They are responsible for fighting the forest fires within the national park. They have failed to do their job. And my colleague Lauren Gunter up in Edmonton, he has documented this very well. The fight going back years on the way that Parks Canada manage Jasper National Park, manages BAM, manages all the areas that they're responsible for. So if this is due to climate change, well then reacting to climate change would require you to do mitigation efforts. Instead, it appears that Parks Canada decided to follow the same route as other jurisdictions like California and not clearing away dry, dead timber that was just sitting there waiting for a spark. So, am I saying that this whole ordeal could have been avoided? No, forest fires are normal. Forest fires are natural. With or without climate change, they have been happening since time began. But what have we done? We have learned how to manage them. And that does not mean just letting things go their natural course. That's not managing. That's letting forest fires get out of control. So I think there's going to have to be a real reckoning and an accounting of who knew what when, who acted, who failed to act. The federal government is responsible for large parts of Alberta's wilderness. And I think there will be a push by some to say that needs to change.
And fortunately, thanks to the efforts of our first responders, our firefighters, Brian, 70% of Jasper was saved, the town of Jasper. So very thankful for that. Brian, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is still on vacation in Tofino, British Columbia. He was recently ambushed by an independent journalist on the beach. And one of the questions asked was if Trudeau was looking to possibly replace himself as Liberal leader. What did Trudeau have to say?
He said no. It was an interesting interview in a couple of ways. Cian Bexley, the independent journalist who shows up on a beach looking for him, found him. It looked like Trudeau's security was just going to do away with him, chase him away. And Trudeau said, no, no, come here. I think he realized what the optics would look like and decided to answer his questions. And when asked, are you looking for a replacement? He said, no. Well, are you worried about your polling? He said, no. Well, why aren't you worried about your polling? He said, because I speak to Canadians all the time. I'm not sure which Canadians he's speaking to, Hal, because the polling is quite clear. The Liberals, they're not at their lowest point, but when you're at 23, 24% in the polls, you're not doing very well. And outside of certain portions of Quebec and, say, downtown Toronto, the Liberals are in real trouble straight across the country. They should be worried about the polls. They should be worried about where things are going, and they should be thinking about changing leaders. But I've been mostly in the camp that Justin Trudeau's not going anywhere. I'm firmly in that camp now.
And what are the recent polls telling us right now in regards to the lead by the federal Conservatives?
The Conservatives are ahead, according to Nanos, by just over 15 points. They're ahead, according to Abacus, by 19 points. Leger, they'll be coming out with another poll shortly. It's going to show a large lead, as they have been for a while. I mean, it has been, I would say, since sometime last fall was when we got into the serious and repetitive double-digit leads. Remember, up until the end of May 2023, the parties were still pretty close. Every once in a while, the Liberals might even be tied or even in the lead by a point or two. But from the end of May 2023 on, the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre have been building a steady lead. And for the last 6 months or more, it has been in that 15 to 22 point range. So that's a massive lead. That's a massive majority. And those are the kinds of numbers that any leader should be looking at and saying, can I turn it around? Perhaps Justin Trudeau thinks he can, and perhaps he's looked at the list of contenders, the list of possible replacements, and said, well, maybe we'll lose, but I'll still do better than all of these guys.
A pair of by-elections have been called for September 16th, the day that Parliament resumes, Brian. One is a seat in Winnipeg, which is held by the NDP, and the other in Montreal, held by the Liberals. Any chance that Conservatives can swoop in and grab both like they did in a Toronto riding recently?
They have no chance of doing that in the Montreal riding. I believe it's LaSalle et Verdun. The riding boundaries have moved a little bit, but this was David Lameddy's riding, the former justice minister who left, and just like many people who leave Justin Trudeau's cabinet or caucus, doesn't have nice things to say about his former boss. Before that, years ago, it was held by Paul Martin. The NDP held it from 2011 until 2015, during that orange wave that Jack Layton and Tom Mulcair were able to orchestrate throughout much of Quebec. They held it then. And right now, the Liberals have a local councillor running. The NDP have had a local councillor running for some time, quite a popular guy. There's a strong chance that the NDP could take that seat. Now, in the Winnipeg by-election, that's, I believe it's Elmwood Transcona, that's an NDP riding right now that could go to the Conservatives. So the Conservatives could take one, the NDP could lose one, but pick up the other. The Conservatives have nominated a candidate who is a member of the local International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. He's active in the union. He's a contractor. The NDP has nominated someone who's head of the local business association. So it's kind of a bizarre world that we're operating in there. But those are the candidates, and interesting timing for this. People will be voting the day that Parliament is scheduled to return for the fall sitting.
Brian, the federal government announced that the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force will keep an eye on all future by-elections, including the two we just chatted about coming up in September. What specifically will they be keeping an eye on? Maybe foreign interference, perhaps?
I think that's going to be a major issue, is foreign interference at play. And you might think, well, what do foreign countries care about a by-election? Well, trying to get your candidate or someone who is in line with you is part of what foreign countries do, whether we're talking India or China. Those are the two main players. Any attempts that Russia has to interfere in Canada is mainly just about discrediting democracy and institutions. They're not looking to install somebody, but India does want to have candidates that are in line with them when it comes to issues like Punjabi independence, the Khalistan movement. China, on a whole bunch of fronts, wants to install their own people. And so we need to be aware of that and be looking. There was an Elections Canada report out recently that recommended something, Hal, that I would have been against a little while ago. And now I'm fully in favor of it. And that's that there need to be rules around nomination meetings. That Don Valley West nomination in Toronto with Han Dong, that riding was going to go to the Liberals. China didn't interfere in the election. They interfered in the nomination process. So I think that we need to go further than just monitoring by-elections. I think that much like in the United States, there are rules around primaries and caucuses where people select the presidential candidate. We need rules around nominations because that's where the interference is going to take place. And in my view, if you're not legally allowed to vote in an election in Canada, you shouldn't be allowed to vote in a nomination race. So, you don't have 14-year-old Chinese nationals who are going to a boarding school in Toronto helping pick the candidate who's going to win the riding for the Liberal Party next time. Right now, the parties, the NDP and the Liberals allow you to vote at 14 in a nomination race, and the Conservatives at 16, and you don't even have to be a citizen. I think all that has to change.
Brian, you reported on a national poll that showed 60% of Canadians feel there are too many immigrants being allowed into Canada. Now, a report from the federal government's own focus group showed 100% of people disagree with the government's immigration policy.
I mean, what a mess. The immigration poll was done by Leger for an organization at McGill University called the Association of Canadian Studies. And they've been tracking views around immigration for some time. I went back just 5 years in their polling, Hal. In 2019, they asked the same question. Are we admitting too many, too few, or just about the right amount? In 2019, 49% of the population said we are letting in just about the right amount. And I think it was 12% said not enough. Only 35% said we're letting in too many people. Fast forward 2024, 60% say too many people. And the number who think that we're letting in too few is down to just 3%. That is a massive sea change. And then for the Privy Council office to do a focus group and not be able to find anybody that thinks they're doing a good job on immigration, that should be telling to the government. But I was speaking with one Liberal just the other day, Hal, and he said, I don't know what's wrong with my party. We tend to double down on bad moves. Instead of admitting that we make a mistake and we're going to course correct, they just double down and they're trying to explain it louder. It's like, finding out somebody can't hear you or doesn't understand you, so you just yell it at them. That's what they're doing right now.
The Trudeau government's commitment to bring in around 5,000 people from Gaza into Canada, Brian, has many people concerned, including American senators. Can you explain?
Yeah, it should have lots of people concerned for various reasons. I remember when I was in Israel, having dinner, a group of us with this gentleman who used to be an officer in the IDF, and when he found out it was going to be 1,000, he was shocked. Never mind 5,000. So, Senator Marco Rubio, Senator Tom Cotton, some others, they've written to Joe Biden's Secretary of Homeland Security and said, we need to start paying attention to the northern border. And they point out in the letter that more than 230 suspected terrorists had been caught up until that point so far in 2024. That's more than an entire year's in some past years. Going back to 2019 and such, you wouldn't even have that many in a year. Now you've got that many in the first 6 months, more than one a day. They're very concerned about that. And then they're saying now our neighbor on the longest undefended border, they're going to bring in 5,000 people from a war-torn region ruled by a terrorist organization where we know that the vast majority support what Hamas did on October 7th. How are we making sure that we're secure? Now, Mark Miller, Trudeau's immigration minister, he was completely dismissive of it. I had written, before he came out and commented on it, I had written and said, we need to take this issue that the Americans have seriously. The border is a very sensitive issue in the United States. After 9/11, you will remember that there were repeated claims. And I think at one point, even Hillary Clinton, while she was a U.S. Senator, made the claim that people who had carried out 9/11 came across the Canadian border. And there were lots of calls to effectively seal it. That didn't happen, in part because Jean Chrétien took the concerns of the Americans seriously. He sent his then Foreign Affairs Minister, John Manley, down to Washington. He was there on a regular basis to work with the Americans to make sure that they felt comfortable. And yes, some things became more difficult to cross at the border, but it wasn't, to use the term he used at the time, it wasn't as thick. The border didn't become as thick as the Americans wanted it to. If we're not careful, we will end up with a thick, difficult to cross border.
Brian, Stats Canada's come out with the latest crime statistics recently, and Tory leader Pierre Poilievre says crime is out of control in Canada. But what does the data really show here?
The data shows that since Justin Trudeau took office, you've got stats like extortion up by 357%. I know that's an issue in Alberta, in particular among the Indo-Canadian community, who are being targeted by boiler rooms operating in India. They're targeting Indo-Canadians in this country with extortion, calling them, making threats. That's a huge issue. That's not the only part of the extortion threat growing, but that's part of it. You've got violent crime up 49% between 2015 and now. These are shocking stats. They are disturbing. I believe it's crimes with firearms up 116%. Those are not duck hunters and sport shooters, Hal. Those are criminals with guns. And Trudeau has made life more difficult for hunters and sport shooters. He has gotten rid of mandatory minimums for a lot of gun crimes, like selling illegal guns. He's made bail easier to get. He has instituted his hug a thug policies. And now we have numbers to show that this is an utter failure. Will he correct course or will he double down? Well, as we were just talking about with immigration, they keep doubling down and they don't seem to realize when they've made a mistake. They did that small bail reform that we've talked about before. That was 1.5 out of 10 is what Frank Caputo called it, the former prosecutor turned conservative MP from Kamloops. They did the bare minimum, and they only did that because every premier dragged them kicking and screaming there. There needs to be more done. They're probably not going to do it because they think this is the right way to go. This is the progressive way to deal with crime, to let it get worse.
Political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks for joining us once again today from Toronto.
Thank you, Hal.